you so much. Thanks for that introduction. And it's on behalf of Andrew and Griff, I've told them to call me Jim. We'll get started. Let's jump right into it. Andrew, can you tell us about the genesis of the exhibit?
Yeah, well, the idea probably started about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that point, it was looking at 5 faiths: Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Catholicism. And it was the same idea about staging interventions, fashion interventions in the spaces of the Met devoted to those belief systems. And that was the original concept for it. And then over the years, just working on the exhibition, about 80% of the designers I was looking at were really gravitating much more to Catholic iconography rather than the other 4 religious beliefs. So there was a big imbalance between Catholicism and the other 4 religions that I was worried it could be misinterpreted. And then when the Vatican came on board, the imbalance was even greater. So it was really that was the idea. And also, there's as you know, a heightened sensitivity or awareness around the relationship between fashion and religion, art and fashion within contemporary culture. And we tried to put on an exhibition that in a way relates to the collective conscience or has a sort of contemporary resonance.
Now you sort of went very quickly over the line when the Vatican came in, which I'm sure every museum wants to know how that happened. How did you first contact the Vatican, and was there any reluctance on their part?
Well, it was Anna Wintour always says that the Met is like the Vatican in terms of its complexity, and there's no comparison. It took 2 years and 12 visits to the Vatican to get the loans. Mainly because we weren't quite sure who to contact to begin with. We went through the museum, the Vatican Museum, because we had relationships, the Met has relationships with the Vatican Museum. And it took 4 visits for us to realize that was the wrong avenue.
Of course, no one would tell you that. No one at the Vatican wants to say, I'm not the right person.
Exactly. And then we finally, thanks to Barbara Yotta, who's the director of the Vatican Museum, directed us into the right direction. And so most of the loans, all the loans came from the Sistine Chapel sacristy. So once we had access to Padre Paolo, who's the custodian for the Sistine Chapel sacristy, it went a bit smoother. And there was a reluctance. The only sort of condition was that the Vatican pieces would be shown separately from the high fashion. And that was the only condition. There was a request that the pieces would also be shown in a white box, so not in the medieval sculpture hall or in the cloisters, for it to be shown in a sort of a wide gallery space. That was a request, but the only condition really was that the Vatican pieces would be shown separately from the fashions.
Would you have liked to show them together?
Yeah, there was a couple of pieces. There was one, the John Galliano for Christian Dior. In terms of the embroidery, it was done by 2 incredible embroidery houses in Paris, 2 Petit Main workshops. But just to compare the embroidery to the embroidery of the Vatican pieces, so I think that would have been a nice comparison. And there was also a Chinese designer called Guo Pei who created a garment that was entirely inspired by a papal tiara. So I think those comparisons would have been good, but yeah. They accepted the Matisse chasuble in the corridor, but none of the fashions.
Now, I, as a layman, I'm always curious, how does a papal tiara or several papal tiaras travel? Did someone have to go over and collect it? Or?
Well, there was one that did come with 2 security guards, which was the one that was made out of, or comprises 18,000 diamonds and 1,000 emeralds and sapphires. That came with bodyguards. But the rest were just art shipped. Yeah.
The rest were?
Shipped by art packers.
Oh, really?
Which is how we normally ship.
Not FedEx box. Now, Griff, how did you determine to use the cloisters? Was that something that happened at the very beginning of the planning, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was there from the very beginning when Andrew had already done a great deal of work, actually. It was about 1.5 years ago that we began working with him, my colleagues in the medieval department, and especially Barbara Bain, the lead curator at the Cloisters installation. By the time we entered the picture, Andrew was already kind of in storyboard, so we walked into a conference room for one of our initial meetings, and there was already the kind of beginnings of the checklist on the walls with some pairings that Andrew had been thinking about. But it was really the framework that I think Andrew began to develop as the show evolved that made a kind of natural separation between the material that's on view in the main building versus the material that is now on view at the Cloisters.
That's interesting. How did you determine which would go where? Was there?
Well, I would say it was really your concept to feature the material in the main building that was directly, well, some of the material in the main building is actually inspired not just by Catholicism and the art that surrounds it, but also by the great traditions of the Eastern Christian Church, namely Byzantine Empire. So there was material that naturally made sense there. And I think some of the quieter costumes and the Cloisters environment really began to emerge as an actor in and of itself. The spaces of the Cloisters really lent themselves to some of the installations that people will see up there.
Were either of you interested in portraying any of the mannequins in prayer on the Fifth Avenue? What do you say, the main building? Is that what you say, the main building?
Yeah.
Because I know at the Cloisters, they look, in a sense, more prayerful. Were you sort of tempted to do that in the...
Well, it's interesting. When we began working, we interviewed several architects to work on the design of the exhibition. And we finally decided to go with DSR, Dillis, Caffidio and Renfrew, mainly because they were able to sort of capture the experience of a church without any of the cliches of wax or incense. So it was, you still got the multisensorial nature of a church experience, but in a more abstract way. So mainly through lighting, to be honest. So once we decided to have them as the architects, we worked with a mannequin company, Proportion in London, to sculpt a face. That was, it was meant to be inspired by the Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica, but it very early transpired that the sculptor wasn't Michelangelo, so he was sort of
unavailable.
Yeah, it was a few, probably about 6 different sculptors before we finally got there. The only thing I really wanted was to have her eyes closed, so to have more of a sort of contemplative or prayerful sort of face. So that's really how we arrived at the mannequin that we finally.
It adds so much to see them with their eyes closed. It makes you feel like you're entering into kind of their space as well.
Mannequins are always hard in an exhibition context because they're obviously static, and part of the whole experience of both fashion but also vestments is the dynamism and in motion. So it's always tricky to have them just in a static sort of space.
Did you decide to? I'm always curious about this. I may not have shared this question with you, but why did you decide to focus so much on what I would call recent fashion and not do 1920s, 19th century? What was the decision-making process?
We have pieces, probably the earliest is from the 20s, and from Schiaparelli, who was a Catholic, a devout Catholic, was actually baptized in St. Peter's Basilica and grew up in the sort of shadows, literally, of St. Peter's Basilica. And Lanvin, also from the 30s, who was very much inspired by the paintings of Fra Angelico, and they're on display in the Lehman wing. But the majority of designers, you're right, really began working with Catholic iconography really from the 80s onwards. And I think in the 90s, part of it was a reaction to the culture wars of the 90s, very similar to the contemporary art movement that was happening at the time as well. So part of it was a sort of reaction to some of the censorship that was happening during the culture wars. But it's interesting seeing, because about 90% of the designers in the show are Catholic, and many no longer practice, but their upbringing really informed their creative development, and that to me came as a surprise. The exhibition is very much inspired by Andrew Greeley and David Tracy's works of the Catholic imagination. And as a curator, you're always interested in finding what, in a way, drives an artist's creative impulses and imagination. And I never thought it would be one's faith or one's religion that really lay at the heart of one's creative imagination. So originally the show was really looking at designers who were inspired by Catholic iconography and symbolism, but as I began working on the show, it became much deeper about the nature of creativity.
Speaking of which, how ever did you get David Tracy? One of the great theologians of our age.
I stalked him for about 2 years.
What was your first, did you read his works on the Catholic imagination? Or?
I did, right. The analogical imagination, which was really heavy going, and Andrew Greeley's is a much more sort of manageable version.
Yes.
So, I sort of was translated through Andrew Greeley, but I literally stalked him, and I wasn't getting, and I didn't really know very much about him, his personality, and I was actually in Paris Paris for the fashion shows, and at midnight my phone rang, and it was David Tracy, and it was an extraordinary phone call, and I never, he was very reluctant in a way to be involved with the exhibition. He was very charming about it, but I think what really sort of clinched it was the Met, and that one of those amazing stories about how he grew up in Yonkers, and him and his father would visit the Met every Sunday, and it was nostalgia and love for his father and love for the Met. And it really persuaded him to really write the piece. So it was really moving, and hearing his story, his personal journey, and how that also contributed to becoming a priest. So it was really one of those magical moments that the Met's impact has on people, which really was what happened.
Well, I have to say, in the Catholic theological community, the response was, I'm not interested in the dresses. How did they get David Tracy?
It's funny, I actually didn't know that story.
Yeah,
Griff,
I didn't realize at the time he was like the J.D. Salinger
he is.
of theology.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful essay. Griff, you've seen people now walk through the cloisters, and is there a sense that you see people responding differently to the art now that they've seen the fashion?
Yeah, I think actually both responding to the different versions of the show, because they do feel, although it's one exhibition, they do have a very distinct sensibility in the cloisters versus in the main building. The main building is a bit noisier, in general, but I think there's a kind of, I don't want to call it reverential atmosphere, but for lack of a better word, there's a real kind of quiet intensity at the cloisters. So I think that the exhibition definitely feels different in those two spaces. And surprisingly, yes, actually, I think a lot of people are looking at the medieval objects that are in the galleries. We've moved a lot of works of art in the main building, not only to make room for the show, but also to create some pairings between the costumes that are on view and the objects that are part of the collection. So it's been really exciting as a medievalist to see people in the galleries that are looking at the collections in a different way and through a completely different lens.
Tell us about the two statues you said that have never been, is it exhibited
Oh yeah,
before?
well, it'll come up in a little while, but there are two polychrome wooden sculptures that are part of the Met's collections, one of which has lived at the cloisters since it opened essentially in 1938 in its present location. And then another one from the collection of J.P. Morgan, which has been in the collection since 1917. They were produced in the same region of France about 700 years ago, and they're together for the first time in New York. It's an amazing thing to see when you walk into that. Actually, it's right here, left and right. The one on the left is usually in the main building. We refer to her as the Morgan Madonna. And then the one on the right is in the Cloisters collection. And it's the first time they've ever been together in New York. So it's an opportunity like that at the beginning of the show is really a wonderful statement, not only about the exhibition itself, but about the richness of the collections at the Met.
Did you know much about fashion before this exhibit?
No, definitely not. And I'm still learning. But no, it's been, I think one of the things that was so striking is I think my way into the show was in the early days when we were talking. We began looking at some of the storyboard, as I said, and this more recent line by Dolce & Gabbana was inspired by the mosaics in Monreale in Sicily. And knowing those mosaics, I was really able to not only see the references that they're making to the mosaics themselves, but also the ways in which the techniques that they're using evoke the kind of piece-by-piece setting of individual tesserae that is an important part of mosaic work. So I think for me, what's been an eye-opener is the extent to which there's such serious craft in fashion, the materials, the choice of materials, the way in which things are cut, and the various choices about what's going to be applied to these garments. That's been certainly a journey for me as a curator.
Before we go any further, I want to say if you have questions, don't forget to write them down on the little cards that have been provided, and then we can ask the questions towards the end. Can we talk a little bit about the reactions? Were either of you worried about Catholic blowback or Catholic pushback at all? Not that there is any in the Catholic Church. On the off chance. Were there worries? Were there worries about that at the beginning? Would you say?
There were, and we work with various members of the Catholic community, yourself included, to look at the storyboard. And more to see whether there was any pieces in the show that might be inflammatory. Not that we would remove them, but just so that we would be prepared for a response. To my dissatisfaction, I remember you saying there was nothing that was inflammatory. So it was sort of, I felt I failed at my job, but it was. I think we were very concerned about it from the different levels. From both the more liberal Catholics who might see the show as being reactionary, and the more.
That's interesting. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, a little bit about the current climate, and the fact that the show really was looking at an aspect of the Catholic faith that was really considered as a Baroque tradition. But also from the more right-wing side, who might see it as being blasphemous or sacrilegious. So, it was both communities we were very sort of conscious of when we were working on the thesis of the exhibition.
And what would you say, both of you, what's been the takeaway for Catholic visitors? I mean, not in the Catholic media, but people that you've spoken to have seen it. What would their reactions be?
Yeah, I don't know if this will directly answer the question, but I think just responding to what Andrew said, for me, one of the main concerns was being authentic to the collection and the historic materials that we are responsible for as curators. So I think that's where we really appreciated the opportunity to work very carefully and early with Andrew on some of the selections. I think many people are amazed by the depth of engagement that some of these designers have had over a long period of time with not only the imagery, but in some cases the costumes of the Catholic Church. I mean, that's one of the things that's striking about the Cloisters. I mean, this image up on the screen, for instance, is in the Ponto chapter house, but there is a kind of comfort that these objects seem to have at the Cloisters in particular that I think speaks to the relationship between the architecture and the kind of sympathetic juxtapositions and pairings that are set up. I mean, there are certainly pieces in there that I think people are surprised by and maybe even offended by, but I think one of the challenges is maybe separating the exhibition from the gala, where their individual responses are much different. So I don't know. I mean, I think for me, the main anxiety was really being as authentic as we could with the objects in the collection.
I think it's amazing to see. For me, it's hard to go to the exhibit. I haven't seen the Cloisters exhibit yet, and not to be impressed with the devotion of the artists, and not to be impressed with how deep the Catholic faith has obviously influenced them. And I mean, I would have a hard time saying, well, this is offensive because I don't like what you did with your inspiration. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to me. So I mean, I think the sort of sensitivity of the Met also may put that in more perspective for people who don't know much about fashion. One of the things I was most impressed about was that the placards were just as detailed about the religious art as they were about the fashion, and that you don't get. I mean, that's one of the benefits of being at the Met, I guess, but that was very impressive.
I think one of the things of fashion is that we wanted the religious artworks to contextualize the fashions, and I think that there is a sort of interesting dynamic when you show fashion alongside a source of origin. I think that they're sort of mutually informing, but also mutually enlivening. So in terms of our community and the fashion community, they might perhaps look at the fashions first, and then we give the artwork second, but they both inform each other, and it was always our intention from the beginning to create a dialogue between the fashions and the religious artworks as a sort of storytelling tradition of the Catholic imagination. So that was very much part of our intent.
Well, it also dawns on me that you might be bringing together two communities that know very little about one another. I mean, nothing against fashion designers, but I'm wondering whether you saw the sort of fashion world entering into a world that they knew less about, and the religious world entering the fashion world that they knew less about. Because it seemed to me walking around the exhibit, you're either from one of two worlds, and it's a kind of entree into this unusual, strange world. Was that your sense, or?
It's part of it was a deliberate sort of sense of discovery. So when you walk through the exhibition, you can access it at any point. It's deliberately sort of confusing. It's meant to sort of evoke a pilgrimage. Starting off in the visiting galleries and going up to the Cloisters. But I think that it's what's been really sort of reassuring is how people are looking at both the religious artworks and the fashion. Don't you find, Griff? And it's sort of, and that's what our intention was. So it's incredible.
Yeah.
In the fashion world, any surprises that people have had that walk through the exhibit that they're surprised about the religious world or about Catholicism that you recall?
I think the extent of which it's inspired fashion designers and the fact that, as I said, most of the designers in the show are Catholic, and the extent to which growing up Catholic has really sort of had a big impact on the creative development. And what I think it's interesting is, the show does obviously look at designers who are inspired by Catholic iconography, but they could equally look at sort of Africa or China as a source of inspiration, but they approach it the same in this sort of storytelling, sort of metaphorical tradition. So I think there is a distinction, and I think I find that very compelling that the designers who grew up Catholic approach their work in a very specific way. It's about storytelling, it's about producing a cast of characters through their collections. So it's been very much ubiquitous among designers who grew up Catholic, and that's surprising, I think.
Has it, without getting too personal, has it influenced your own, shall we say, relationship to the church, working on this exhibit?
It has in a way, because I grew up Catholic, but in terms of my sort of education within Catholicism, it really stopped when I was about 14, really, when I stopped taking religious studies. So I got a very sort of childlike and very naive approach to my faith and really my knowledge. So it did, obviously, I was much more sort of had a crash course in doctrine and came across sort of like myths that I have held all my life, like the fact that Mary Magdalene, I always thought she was a prostitute.
Yeah, poor Mary Magdalene.
And I know. And it's sort of like, oh my God, that was a myth from the medieval period. So it was extraordinary, some of my own personal sort of mythologies that were debunked. But it was, it's been extraordinary. I think part of it also is recognizing the centrality of the body to Catholic belief, and that's something that is also very much about fashion. The fashion's all about the body, and the Catholic doctrine is really about the body incarnation or the transubstantiation, and I found that really interesting in terms of that the inherent carnality of Catholicism, and which very much connects it to fashion.
Beautiful. Now, Griff, you obviously as a medievalist would have a lot of interest in church history, and did this exhibit give you a different appreciation or understanding of the church, would you say?
I think what it called out for me is the extent to which dress is embedded not only in the visual arts associated with Catholicism and Christianity more broadly, but also the extent to which dress is invoked at key moments in scriptures. You think about the Balenciaga wedding gown that's up on view at the Cloisters. There is this kind of, Andrew would be able to speak to this more directly, but this idea that it was fashioned out of one, it's a seamless garment, right? In fact, it actually is very carefully put together, and it's not many pieces of fabric, but it's not exactly seamless. But nevertheless, at the crucifixion, you have Christ wearing a seamless garment. You have the whole issue of investiture, vesting oneself with clothing. So I think I've actually, as a result, paid attention to aspects of my own discipline and facets of it, textiles, costumes, that I probably wasn't nearly as mindful about prior to working on the show with Andrew and Barbara Bain and my colleagues.
Now, earlier you brought up the gala, and I'm wondering if both of you could talk about whether or not you feel like the hoopla, positive and negative, distracted at all from the exhibit itself, which is very serious and very scholarly, I would say. Andrew, you must deal with this every year, but I'm wondering if both of you could talk about any worries or maybe what you saw as any of the, fallout, positive or negative, from the gala. What would you say, Griff?
Right, so I think I know that I have someone praying for me in Kansas City because she was very upset by the
praying
gala.
For you or against you?
She's praying for me, I think. But we had an email exchange which was ultimately about the exhibition, but I think it's complicated by the gala. And you know, the gala obviously is the kickoff for the exhibition. It's the fundraiser for the Costume Institute. And I think in some ways, the press at that moment is as focused on the gala as it is on the exhibition.
Right.
And I think it's nice to see those two things being disengaged from each other. Not to say that they're not part of the same kind of general program, but yeah, I do think that the gala, there's so much attention on that moment that it's nice to see the exhibition being evaluated on its own terms.
What would you say?
Yeah, I think I mean, every year, it's a worry in terms of the impact of the gala compared to the exhibition. It's very church and state in terms of the fact that the gala is a party, it's a fundraiser. And that's basically its primary intention, is to raise funds for the Costume Institute. And without the gala, we wouldn't be able to do the work we do. So there's that component. There's also the dress code component, which is always a concern. And this year in particular, and the theme, every year, you have a dress code. And this year it was Sunday best, with the sort of hint about dressing perhaps more modestly than previous years. And even though it didn't seem like it, they did dress. The guys did dress more modestly.
There was a lot less skin.
Much less, bits showing. And so in actual fact, it was. But I think it's an extraordinary evening, and at the end of the day, it's a fundraiser party, and where we benefit enormously from it. And part of it is the attention the gala gets, and we bask in that reflected glory in a way. It gets hundreds of thousands of hits on Vogue.com, and as a result, it enhances the awareness of the exhibition. So, it's extraordinary.
To shift gears a little bit, and maybe we can talk about the clicker is somewhere for the PowerPoint. I don't know, I'm sure it's around, but maybe we could talk about some of the individual pieces. So as we scroll through, let's talk about, that's a Matisse, right?
This is the Matisse.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And
from Vons, and in actual fact, this is the prototype that was developed, that Matisse developed, and it was too heavy for priests to wear, so actually he donated it to the MoMA. So this is actually a prototype for the other 6 chasubles that Matisse developed. I think 2 of my favorite pieces are 2 garments that were created by designers for actual Madonna and Child statues in churches, and one by Saint Laurent, which was developed or made for a Madonna and Child statue in Our Lady of Graces in Paris. And the other was a piece by Michel David-Weill, who at the time was a Givenchy, who created vestments for a Madonna and Child within a church in Puglia. And to me, they're extraordinary, because the tradition of the dressed Madonna, which what Griff was referring to with the 2 earlier enthroned virgins, is one of the big themes in the exhibition.
so for people who aren't familiar, it's almost like the Infant of Prague. It's being dressed. Is that a recent tradition, or is that?
No, I mean, the dressing of important statues is something that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, especially on important feast days, and donations of objects also. You'd have statues that were dressed according to either the feast day or the liturgical calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And which were your favorite pieces, would you say?
On that, just
Yeah,
quickly on that,
feel
just
free.
the difficulty with that was that when we asked to borrow the pieces, they said, "Oh, it's great, we'd love to, but we need it back in June for the Feast of the Assumption." And it's like, well, it's a 6-month exhibition, so yeah. So I'm not
How
sure.
did you work that out?
I think they've got a duplicate. Yeah. So we have this for 6 months anyway.
They didn't want to move the Feast of the Assumption. So. Can you talk? One of the things I was surprised about was you talked about having garments that are closer to current day, and one would think that actually, because we are getting into a more secular age, that the influence of religion on fashion would actually diminish. Do you think that's the case? Do you think it's kind of tailing off because people are becoming less religious, or do you think there's still an inherent fascination with Catholic imagination?
There is, and there's an inherent fascination, I think, with the expressions of Catholic doctrine rather than the doctrine themselves. So it's the sort of the church windows, it's the church architecture. So it's the stories around Catholicism and the iconography. So it's less about the doctrine per se and more about the expressions of that. And I think for the designers who were raised Catholic, there's a sort of nostalgia. As many of the designers no longer practice, and there's very few pieces in the exhibition which are deliberately provocative or confrontational. To me, most of it was really coming out of a sense of nostalgia. So it's difficult to know when and what sparks that imagination. With the collection that Griffith mentioned about the Monreale, that was sparked by the fact that the designers went back to Sicily, where they was born, and went to the cathedral, and that inspired the collection. But I think it's the designers who are born and raised Catholic continue and to revisit that iconography and that idea of storytelling.
I was actually shocked at the dresses that were taking off from Dominican habits, and I had no idea that fashion designers would be influenced so directly by, obviously women, women religious and their habits and vestments. I was shocked to see, women's dresses that looked exactly like a bishop's cassock, or and to see that sort of filtered through their imagination was quite beautiful. Yeah. What would you say, in more generally, how do you see the role of beauty in transmitting faith? Can we start with you in terms of
I think
what's up at the Cloisters?
I think it's central. I mean, I think that one of the easy parts about kind of working with Andrew on this project is that throughout the Middle Ages, beauty has been a fundamental vehicle for an expression of faith, in this case, a Christian faith. I mean, the soaring Gothic cathedral is an expression of striving for trying to achieve or give that sense of an extraordinary space, a space that you've never kind of experienced in your day-to-day life, that sense of uplift. I mean, at the same time, what's interesting is even in the 13th century, 12th century earlier, there's discussions about the difference between beauty as it's expressed in the church and the costliness that's involved in some of that expression. So I think that's one of the interesting things about the exhibition now, is that one of the flashpoints is certainly the kind of seemingly excess of some of these garments. And that's not a new conversation. That's a conversation that goes all the way back to people like Bernard of Clairvaux, who's writing at the middle of the 12th century. So I think for me, beauty is a fundamental and central aspect of an expression of faith. Trying to visualize something that you can't see. I think that's a pretty powerful motivator for the imagination.
Also, that the flashpoint of what Pope Francis is trying to do now, which is to try to simplify. And a Catholic friend of mine said, it was very interesting that the loans from the Vatican are John Paul and before, right? And the question was, are they doing that on purpose? Was the Vatican trying to make a point? I said, I don't know if the Vatican understands fashion that well. But the idea that Francis himself would eschew the triple tiaras, what would you say, how does, maybe in your own life, how does beauty transmit faith, would you say?
I think that part of this show was, part of the inspiration was also Balthazar's work on theological aesthetics, where he talks about how one's first perception of the mystery of God is less about truth and more about beauty. And I think that Benedict talked a lot about how beauty was the sort of bridge between the believer and the non-believer. And I think it's something that's very sort of, in that way, the sublime, the idea of how it does change how you perceive a viewpoint. And I think that part of the show is trying to create a more nuanced look at how beauty can affect faith.
Let's now that I have the clicker, let's see if we can pause.
That's one of the.
Yeah, here's the. Can we talk a little bit about that and maybe describe the provenance and what we're seeing?
Yeah. So this is the piece that was made by Saint Laurent for the Church of the Our Lady of the Graces in Paris, and it's an extraordinary sort of fate of the haute couture. The craftsmanship's extraordinary. Apart from the icicles you see are actually from Christmas decorations. So from Swedish Christmas decorations, but this was a piece that he designed in the 80s.
Here we go.
Yeah, for the Madonna that was based on the Virgin of Our Graces.
And is it still in the church?
So it's still in the church. Yeah.
And do they have other designs?
They have a duplicate of this one.
And if you go back one slide, you'll see in that one shot, both of those garments were made for statues.
My church, unfortunately, does not have those. Now this was the one, I found this, these are the ones that are based on Dominican habits.
On nuns. Yeah,
Right,
nuns'
and then
habits,
there's the Daughters of Charity on the right, so-called God's geese, by the way, because of the. So who can you? I know very God's geese because they had the. I know very little about fashion. So is this all one designer? Can you explain who these are?
Moschino on the far right, Dolce, a young designer called Simone, and then Tom Brown, all again Catholics, and this particular part of the exhibition was really inspired by Fellini's ecclesiastical fashion show in his movie Roma, which has a sort of very satirical approach to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And for the Met Fifth Avenue, we wanted to focus on the sort of pageantry and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and the gender distinctions. And then for the Met Cloisters, really the more sort of reflective and reverential side of the Catholic Church. That was the sort of dichotomy.
And then here are the Catholics. That could be right out of Gamarelli's in Rome. Are these all one designer, or?
So these are also mixed designers. Interesting. The one on the far right was by a designer for Balenciaga, and it's actually made from fabric that is supplies textiles to the Vatican.
On the right.
On the right, yeah. And then this is the John Galliano for Christian Dior.
This is the one that you said you would have paired with Vatican.
With the Vatican pieces.
Yeah.
Now, here's another layman question. Would someone wear this going out with the mitre? Other than certain bishops?
Yeah. This is actually made and worn by a man. It has 18-inch waist. So it's...
Now, that's interesting. Why so many women's designs and I would say relatively few men's designs? Why is that?
Yeah, I think that, just the forms of the liturgical dress, the cassocks, lend themselves more to women's wear than to men's wear. And I think that men's wear is really defined by its invisibility. It progresses much slower than women's wear. And part of the idea, apart from Rick Owens, who designed one of the more inflammatory pieces in the exhibition, which Barbara, who's here tonight, who's a curator of the Cloisters, I had to it's her least favorite piece in the exhibition, and it's based on a sort of Chaucerian sort of monk with a flasher monk. And it's one of the pieces that is the most inflammatory pieces in the exhibition. But there's very few designers who work with the sort of typology of Catholic dress.
Let's see if we can find some in the Cloisters. I would like to ask Griff. That's at the Fifth Avenue, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. That's beautiful.
And then this, we should mention that part of the exhibition is in the Lehman wing of the Met. So this is the section that's in the Lehman wing.
Are these the ones inspired by Teresa in Ecstasy, Teresa of Avila?
It is the middle one, and the rest were inspired by the frescoes of Frangelico in San Marco.
Beautiful. Let's see if we can find. Here we go.
Yeah, now we're at the Cloisters.
So these are the ones with the two statues that were together?
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit about what's in the middle, the dress?
So this is a dress by Victor and Rolf, and it references the idea of the dress Madonna in terms of the silhouette, but also if you look closely at the wrists, which are adorned with rosary beads. So the actual collection was called the Russian Doll Collection, which was really a collection that was a Russian doll in reverse, and this was the penultimate look in the collection that was directly related to the sort of the silhouette, but also the tradition of the dress Madonna.
She does look at home there. So maybe some questions from the audience at this point? And bring them up. Not sure if we have any yet.
Right behind you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay. I'll ask you only the hard ones. It's interesting. How would you encourage people to take a careful look at the art, to understand the conversation between fashion and the art? What a great question. How would you encourage people, both of you, to look at this? What would you say, Griff?
So one of the ways in which we've tried to do that explicitly is that those objects in the Met's permanent collection that we think of as related to the exhibition, we've given labels that are black in the case of the main building. So the labels for the show are all connected by that same graphic look. So there are ways of discerning from a curatorial point of view, those pairings that we really wanted people to pay attention to. But I think for many people, especially at the Cloisters, it might be their first visit to the Cloisters. And the exhibition really fills the whole museum, including a section of the gardens, as you're about to see in a little while. So I think just to be open to coming to the Cloisters and the main building and seeing these as two sides of the same show that might feel quite different but are still united by these common ideas. But if people really want to see what we thought of in terms of the objects that, from a curatorial point of view, are in the collection that should be relating to the fashion objects, it's by paying attention to the labels that are all the same set of labels.
Here's a great question. I'll ask you, Andrew. An exhibition like this is the result of many decisions. What decision did you wrestle with the most?
I think it was really, because the original idea of the 5 different religions, I think was a really strong idea. And I think perhaps in retrospect, if I'd focused on the veil, for example, as an item of dress that crosses the 5 religions, it would have been an easier show to have curated. I think that we barely managed doing this exhibition, so to do 5 would have been impossible. But I wish that I had focused perhaps just on that one aspect, the veil, and as a way of unity and as a way into looking at the different 5 religions.
One of the things I was surprised at, I think I mentioned this the first time we met, was that I thought that there would be more just plain mannequins with religious habits. Did you consider that at all, having, for example, the Daughters of Charity, just to have the habit there? In terms of contextualizing that, was that?
You know, we did initially think about that, and you know, part of the exhibition was really to also showcase religious art within a museum context and the changing nature of religious art within a museum context. So the fashions were chosen deliberately to create a relationship, a dialogue between those religious artworks. So the show really isn't a sort of history of fascist engagement with Catholicism. It's much more a series of interventions between existing curatorial narratives that were established by Griff and Barbara and Melanie and Helen within the Met's collection. So the fashions were chosen really as a direct response to existing curatorial narratives.
Okay, another great question. The Costume Institute puts so much sensitivity and attention into communities connecting to your exhibit, e.g. Chinese community in 2015. How much are you willing to question / spark controversy relating to those same communities? Is that kind of inevitable, would you say, or what would you think?
In terms of the responses?
Yeah, I mean, how far are you willing to push to?
I think part of the idea for the exhibition is for it to be a platform to raise issues surrounding the relationship between art and religion. It's always been a very contested relationship, particularly since the culture wars of the 90s. So I think part of the exhibition was to, in a way, encourage a more nuanced sort of look at that relationship between art and religion and fashion and art and religion in general.
Here's a question for Griff. So best of, which piece do you think in the Cloisters best combines the world of fashion and religion?
I think for me, one of the more dramatic moments of the installation is the Balenciaga wedding dress in the Fontevecchia Chapel. I mean, there's something about the purity of the design itself. I mean, the lines are so clean and graceful, and it resonates for me with the Romanesque architecture in that space, which is all about these kind of beautiful lines, the sense of volume, the proportions. All of those, I think, are formal characteristics that one can connect to the dress itself as well.
There were no photos of popes wearing the articles exhibited, i.e. vestments, tiaras, etc. Was this a conscious decision? If so, why no photos of popes?
I think that I really wanted the objects to stand alone. I mean, what I found interesting working with the Sistine Chapel was how popes had particular sort of personalities that came across in the vestments. So Pope Pius, who I think reigned one of the longest, was quite the dandy. So his garments are much more flamboyant than perhaps other popes. So it was interesting to see how personalities, individual personalities, came through in the vestments that were very codified vestments. But I also wanted them to stand really as object, because when you look at the cassock that was worn by St. John Paul II, you see him without needing to see a picture of him. It's an extraordinary moment. It has such a strong, affecting presence. The absence of him actually makes the piece stronger than the presence of him. So that was one of the main decisions.
I was shocked that you got that, actually. I was shocked that you were able to get that. How many of his cassocks would they have?
That one I know was later in life, and if you look at it, he shrank as we all do when we get older. But if you look at the piece, he also stooped. So the front of the cassock is much shorter than the back of it. It's because of his actual posturing. So he wore it much later in life. And one of the coups of the fashion world really were the red shoes that he wore, which. As you know, when Pope Benedict wore the red shoes, there was a huge outcry in Newsweek saying the Pope wears Prada, and there's a sort of mythology around those shoes that Pope Benedict wore Prada, which wasn't the case. They were designed by a local cobbler in Italy. But also that it speaks to the Catholic imagination and the fact that those Catholic vestments have such a big impact and a strong impact on one's imagination.
There's when the Pope is elected, Gamarelli, the papal tailor, produces 3 different cassocks. Did you know this? Sort of small, medium, and large, so he can sort of step into it. And Benedict got a lot of critique when he stepped out of the balcony. It was seen as a huge fashion faux pas in the Vatican that he put his cassock over, it was cold, I guess, over the sweater. So in the first picture, when he has his arms out, you can see the black sweater, which people did not like in the Vatican. Are you here, not to put you on the spot, but are you a little disappointed that Francis is a little more simple in his essence?
Well, I know it's equally an ostentatiousness to his garments than the more Baroque pieces. It's a different form of ostentation, but to me, it's a similar ostentation.
He brought the same chasuble and mitre over from Argentina. If you see the brown one that he uses with the stripe, he's got a lot of pushback from some fashionistas in the Vatican about that as well. Is there any jewelry in the exhibit?
There is a lot, actually. There's papal rings, there's clasps, there's pectoral crosses, and then papal tiaras, and one of which was the one that was given to Pope Pius IX by Queen Isabella of Spain, which has the 19,000 precious stones. So yeah, there's a lot of jewelry represented.
What was the question I missed? Here's an interesting question. If it weren't for the Met Gala, would the exhibition have happened?
Yes, yeah. And as I said, the gala is extraordinary in terms of its fundraising, and Anna's our sort of fairy godmother. But yes, it's a show that I've been thinking about doing for a long time. It took a different direction, but yeah.
Was there one piece that was difficult to get? Or that you had to try to get?
I think it's probably the 2 Madonna and Child vestments, just because of the calendar. We couldn't get it until after Christmas because they were on display. So it was more logistics more than anything else. It wasn't philosophical, it was just practicalities.
Is there anything that the 2 of you would do differently now that you've seen the crowds go through?
I suppose you always rethink the pinch points. I mean, I think we knew that there was going to be a lot of foot traffic in the main building. And it was pretty amazing the first week just to really get a sense for the first time to see what that show felt like when it was full of visitors. I don't know that there are dramatic things that I would rethink. As I said, I mean, people that know our medieval collections in the main building well will see that there's some large objects that we've moved around. And it's been interesting actually to see them in a new context. But I think we've been fine-tuning things as we've gone along. We've added some stanchions to help with some of the crowding. But I don't know, are there things that you would do differently now that you see it?
I think maybe just the Lehman collection, because I mean, the idea for the Fifth Avenue was this idea of following the longitudinal plan of a church, and the choir screen was meant to be this physical and conceptual divide between the secular hierarchy and the celestial hierarchy. And I like the fact that the collection you saw by Rodarte, the Frangelico Angels, I like the fact that you can see it at a distance, but I don't think people are going to that part of the exhibition. So I think the distance was too great, I think.
Are there pieces that you wish you could have gotten that were out of reach?
There was one designer who I wanted to be included in the show who didn't want to participate. So that's probably the only example.
How about in the, was there anything that caught your eye in the papal sacristy?
Well, it was extraordinary because initially, on the first visit, you were shown just, a couple of items, and they would open the door and a cupboard, and you see, gosh, about 40 different chasubles, and they go to the third one and close it. So they were huge teasers. But then by the end of it, they gave me the key to.
Any other tiaras that you would want to bring over? Or?
I think the one I wanted was the one I got, the 19,000. Yeah.
What would you, a final question, what would you hope that Catholics first and non-Catholics take away from this show? Griff, what would you say? Let's say up at the Cloisters.
I mean, I'm speaking as a non-Catholic, so I think that for me, it's that fashion can be a high art. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think that's something that we might take for granted at the Met, where we have a costume institute and it's one department among other curatorial departments, but the sense of artistry with these objects, and particularly with the garments I'm talking about, is really, in some cases, mind-boggling. And I think that sense of, even in a machine age, that sense of handcraft being such a powerful stimulus to one's imagination, and such a creative vehicle for expression of complicated ideas. I think for me, that's one of the big takeaways, is that Catholic Church and Christianity has served as a reservoir of deep inspiration, and that the handcraftedness of these garments is still something that you can very much see, and it's very palpable in the show.
Well, it's like that. There's one that said that, I don't remember what the placard said, but it took how many sisters, how many years to do the vestment? Do you remember
16 years. 15 women, 16 years to embroider.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
It reminds me of the great story, apocryphal, I guess, of the master sculptor who was carving a statue for some little niche in Chartres, and he's working on the back and all the folds of the dress, and someone says to him, "Why are you doing that?" No one's going to see it, and he says, "God will see it."
Yeah.
So there was that great sense of attention.
Yes.
What would you hope that, say, Catholics and non-Catholics take away from the show, Andrew?
I think whether one's faith, in terms of how one was brought up, one's education, whether it has impacted one's creative development, so whether you're Catholic or not, Protestant, whether your faith and your religious beliefs, either whether you're practicing or not anymore, whether it has had an impact on your creative impulses, your imagination. I think that primarily.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Please join me in thanking Griff and Andrew.